Hi, I am Sherlock. Welcome to my new mystery case.
It was in that raw interval when London's spring pretends to charity, yet bites like November, that I sat across from my friend in the familiar chaos of Baker Street. Holmes, cross-legged upon the corner of the settee, had spread about him a flotilla of clippings and envelopes, to which he gave the patient attention of a naturalist pinning beetles. Outside, the street organs worked their plaintive trade in the drizzle. Within, the fire emitted a consoling economical glow, for Mrs. Hudson had formed stern resolutions about our coals after a certain winter of extravagance. "You observe, Watson," said Holmes, holding a triangle of blue vellum in the tongs, "how the man who folds a letter betrays his temperament. The over-sharp crease argues a conscience that must define every boundary, yet here we have a crease deliberately dulled, pressed once, then smoothed away. That is the compromise of a mind which prefers the semblance of rule to the rule itself." "Or the compromise of a correspondent with clumsy fingers," said I, with no great faith in my own epigram. Holmes smiled. There spoke the humane physician who sees accident where I see intention. It is well that life keeps us in partnership. You prevent me from becoming a machine, I prevent you from becoming credulous. Before I could fashion a rejoinder, there came a hurried tap at the door, and our landlady ushered in a gentleman whose very entrance compelled our sympathy. He was of middle years and good condition, with that pallor about the lips which in my practice I have observed in men who have battled a night of pain or terror. His attire, black frock and a hat clutched nervously against his chest, would have been wholly conventional but for two peculiarities. The first was the faint, irregular dusting of pale flour upon his left sleeve. The second, a small square ticket, buff-coloured and perforated, protruding from the fob of his waistcoat. The man attempted to speak, failed, and with an effort that twisted his features into a grimace, produced no more than a breathless rasp. His right hand, shaking, extended a visiting card. Holmes took it with a bow. "Sir Alister Venn of Bishopsgate." His eyes travelled, not to the engraved name, but to a minute smudge upon the card's lower corner. "Violet ink," he murmured, "unusual upon a gentleman's desk." Then to our visitor, with a gentleness I have seen him reserve for the profoundly stricken. "Pray be seated. You shall tax your throat no further than is necessary. If you will allow me to play interpreter, a nod shall suffice for affirmation, a shake for denial." Sir Alister, with enormous relief, let himself drop into the chair by the hearth. He was, as I knew by repute, a barrister who had lately become the conscience of a certain commercial reform, one of those gifted mouths which can persuade a jury to exchange its prejudice for his. To see such a man robbed of speech struck even my practical soul as a species of cruelty. Holmes, meanwhile, raised the buff ticket with his violinist's fingers. "A tramway ticket, Bishopsgate to Shoreditch, returned half," he observed. "Punched within the last 12 hours. You came to us not in a brougham, Sir Alister, but by humble conveyance. That argues haste and a wish to avoid observation." He glanced at the flower. "And you tarried in a bakehouse or a kitchen, not your own. Forgive me. I do not mean to be spectacle-maker to your affliction. Watson, our man is in pain. Your professional eye?" I bent to the task. The membranes of the throat were neither inflamed nor exudative. The caudal edges, to the degree that I could examine them under the circumstances, without lesion. There was dryness of the mucosa and a singular tremor of the laryngeal muscles when he attempted phonation. I found no fever, and the pulse, though quickened by agitation, was regular. A temporary aphonia of nervous or chemical origin suggested itself. "Have you been given any draught or lozenge within the past night?" I asked. Sir Alister's eyes widened. He nodded vigorously. Fumbling in his pocketbook, he produced a little glassine packet with a wax seal impressed by a bishop's mitre. Within lay 2 lozenges, amber-coloured and faintly crystalline. I lifted them to my nose. An odour, cold and medicinal with a suggestion of anise, rose from them. There was also an elusive sharpness, what my old hospital master used to call a stinging ghost, that put me in mind of certain atropinic tinctures administered for catarrh. Holmes had been observing us with the amused expression of a man who lets 2 hounds circle the cover before he gives the view halloo. He tapped the packet. "A bishop's mitre, Watson. How comforting that the symbol should be honest. The thing has come from Bishopsgate as surely as if the street itself had stamped it." Our visitor, impatient of our leisurely fencing while his emergency pressed, thrust forward a folded sheet of blue vellum, the twin, indeed, of the fragment which had lain upon our table when he entered. Holmes's eye lighted as if a known adversary had stepped upon the stage. He opened it. The message was printed from letters cut from a newspaper and fixed with gum, a fashion in threats now lamentably common since a certain notorious case had advertised its efficacy. It read, "Sir Alister Venn, keep silence until midday Wednesday, or your voice will speak no more. Take the pastilles on your mat for relief. Fail, and the consequence shall be permanent." The choir. "The choir!" I exclaimed. "What on earth?" "A name chosen to appease the author's sense of humour," Holmes returned, "or his sense of blasphemy. Observe the paper. The letters are from different fonts, the Morning Herald, and a street advertisement. The gum is thick, uneven. The hand that did this is careful, yet unskilled." Sir Alister, with an impatient gesture, pointed to his throat, then to the letter, then to the clock upon our mantel, which had just chimed 10:15. He flung his hands wide, as if to say that in 3 days his life's instrument must be restored, else all was ruin. His eyes burned upon us with a desperate eloquence. "Compose yourself," said Holmes. "You shall be intelligible to the courts again, if it be in my power to give you back what Providence has lent. Let us proceed without delay. You received this letter this morning?" A nod. "And the pastilles were upon your mat," added Charity from our anonymous singer. "You took one?" A reluctant half-nod, guilt and gratitude struggling in his face. Holmes's countenance tightened. "Watson?" "I would not have advised it," said I, "though the effect, if this be their origin, appears to be suppression rather than inflammation. The dryness may wear off, yet the threat of permanence, if we suppose an agent, would argue something designed for repetition to deepen the mischief." "Just so." Holmes rose and passed to the window. The rain had abated to a dampness that London calls mercy. He looked not at the street, but at the lower sill where a faint, sooty crescent smudged the paint. "Mrs. Hudson must curse me. My cigar ashes have their revenge," he said absently, and then faster to Sir Alister. "Before we go further, a few particulars. Your profession, your present business, your enemies." Venn drew a notebook and scribbled in a firm lawyer's hand, tearing out leaves for us to read. In a few minutes we had the outline. 3 days hence, at the Bishopsgate Institute. Holmes nodded at the name. I recalled the fine new hall near Liverpool Street. Sir Alister was to preside at a public inquiry concerning a syndicate of warehousemen whose practices, if proved, would expose certain noble names to disgrace. He had in his possession affidavits and a sworn deposition from a clerk now in hiding. He had received 2 anonymous warnings in the past week. This third had been accompanied by the lozenges. Upon the night just past, the butler had been found insensible in the mews with a cut upon his temple. A window of Sir Alister's dressing-room stood open. Upon the inner sill there had rested, when the household woke, a little pasteboard box bearing the ecclesiastical seal, and beneath it a scrap of blue vellum the size of a postage stamp. Holmes's long fingers steepled. The butler fell to an assailant's cosh, or to his own surprise. Venn wrote, "No valuables taken, only a bruise." He says he heard a whistle, unlike any he had known, thin, as if from a kettle long upon the boil. Holmes's eyes shifted to that earlier smudge of flour. "You have a kitchen of your own, Sir Alister, yet that is the flour of a public bake, soft pour in bran. You halted at a shop this morning, then?" A nod. To speak by slate? A shadow of humour crossed the stricken man's face. He produced from his pocket a schoolroom slate with the word "help" scrawled upon it in capital distress. Holmes laughed softly. "Excellent. Now the ticket." Venn wrote, "Left cab at Bishopsgate to avoid being followed." "Ah, so the choir has a chorister in your street." Holmes gave me a quick glance. "Watson, our friend is watched." He did wisely to change conveyances, yet the pursuer, if any, had only to observe the flower upon his sleeve to know that he paused where warm loaves caught cold hearts. He turned. "Sir Alister, one last point. You have lately used violet ink, not your usual. From whom did you borrow it?" Venn looked astonished, then scribbled a name. "Miss Elena Markham, my ward. She keeps her correspondence in violet. I signed an enclosure last night at her desk." Holmes's face, which had been brisk and playful like a terrier at a rabbit-hole, assumed the grave alertness I knew too well. "Your ward lives with you?" "Yes." A hesitation. "She is to sing at the Institute on Wednesday, a charitable duet with a Mr. Pargeter, a tenor." "The choir indeed," Holmes murmured. He rang for his coat. "Watson, your hat. Sir Alister, keep that packet unopened. It is evidence, and perhaps a weapon, turned upon its maker. We shall first visit Bishopsgate to read the mat on which London left you its venom. Then to your kitchen, your dressing-room, and your ward's desk. I would also speak with your butler, and with this Mr. Pargeter, whose tenor is, I trust, less thin than the whistle he imitates." Sir Alister rose. His gratitude expressed itself not in sound, but in a tightening of the hand upon Holmes's sleeve. My friend, who was not insensible to such tributes, merely patted the hand and accepted the emotion as he would accept a flower pressed in a book. As we descended to the street, Holmes paused upon the landing and stooped to the skirting board. With the pad of his forefinger, he lifted a minute filament of blackened thread. "Lampblack," he said, "not mine. Laid here since yesterday evening, you see, Watson. When one listens for a choir, one must be attentive to the smallest note. I fancy our choristers practice in unusual places." He slipped the soiled thread into his pocket-case, and we stepped forth into the damp light of Baker Street, bound for Bishopsgate, and a silent man whose voice, if I know anything of Sherlock Holmes, would not be silent long. The hansom rattled eastward through the greased streets, the lamps glimmering like molten beads upon the wet cobbles. Holmes leaned back against the seat, his long fingers steepled in that familiar gesture, while our client sat mute beside him, his features strained by the effort of suppressing both fear and impatience. I could not help glancing at Sir Alister with professional curiosity. Every flicker of his eyes, every tightening of his jaw, seemed to suggest the torture of a man whose weapon, his voice, had been snatched from him at the very moment of greatest need. Holmes, for his part, allowed the silence to deepen until even the clatter of the horses' hooves seemed subdued, and only then did he speak. "Watson, you noted the dryness of the membranes, the absence of lesion, and the peculiar tremor. That tremor is not unlike the result of a minute alkaloid applied in stages. A clever fellow might contrive a temporary paralysis without leaving the obvious traces of an irritant." "You believe, then, that the lozenges are the cause?" I asked. "I am convinced they are the instrument, though not necessarily the origin." Observe the dramatic irony. A barrister silenced on the eve of his case. The perpetrators could scarcely contrive a more pointed assault. But consider, too, the choice of method. To kill the man outright would be to court suspicion and scandal. To rob him of speech while leaving him in health ensures confusion, delay, and perhaps the collapse of his inquiry. That is a subtler cruelty, Watson, and more dangerous. Sir Alistair, catching these words, thumped his cane upon the floor of the cab and gave Holmes a look of gratitude mingled with despair. My friend inclined his head. "Rest assured, sir. The human voice is a fragile instrument, but I believe yours is not destroyed, only muted by design. The trick lies in finding the hand that offered the sweetened poison." We drew up at last before the dignified Georgian facade of Sir Alistair's house in Bishopsgate. The drizzle had ceased, leaving the flagstones slick as a mirror. A constable loitered on the corner, summoned, no doubt, by the disturbance of the night before. Within, the household was subdued, the servants whispering as if in a church, and the butler, a grey, hollow-cheeked fellow, awaited us with a bandage across his brow. Holmes regarded the man with one swift glance, noting the posture of guilt that bent his shoulders. "You heard the whistle?" Holmes asked. The butler nodded. "Thin, sir, like a child's tin toy. Then darkness." Holmes bent, studying the man's bandage. A glancing blow, not intended to kill. "Our visitor wished you silent, not slain." He straightened. "Lead us to the mat where the box was found." In the vestibule, the tiled floor gleamed faintly with a trace of polish. The butler pointed to the threshold, where the faintest shadow of damp remained. Holmes went down upon one knee, his magnifying lens flashing like a monocle of fire. I saw him pluck from the corner a tiny grain of wax, blackened at the edge. He balanced it on his finger and gave a satisfied hum. "Sealing wax," he said. "Not the colour of the bishop's mitre, but plain black, as used in commercial offices." The packet was tampered with and resealed by clumsy hands. "Note, Watson, how it is half-burned, melted with a candle no better than a tallow dip. Our singer has rehearsed his notes in poor company." Sir Alistair gestured towards the stairs, and we followed him up to his dressing-room. Here the window still bore the marks of forced entry. Holmes measured the gap with his long hand, noting where the catch had been filed. "A deft worker," he murmured, yet in haste. "See, Watson, the shaving of wood left upon the sill, a splinter lodged in the putty." He entered from the mew's roof. "And here? Ah." He stooped to gather from the carpet a thread of red silk no longer than a pin's length. "Silk," Holmes said quietly. "And not from your garments, Sir Alistair?" "No. Then we have the first voice of our choir." From there we passed into the library, where Miss Elena Markham awaited us. She was a young woman of striking presence, her features pale yet spirited, and in her eyes a blend of anxiety and defiance. Before her lay a sheaf of music, the topmost page marked in violet ink. Holmes greeted her with the courtesy he reserves for women of intelligence, though I noticed he observed her fingers as much as her face. "You write in violet ink, Miss Markham?" She nodded. "It is a harmless fancy, Mr. Holmes. I find black so severe." Holmes smiled faintly. "Fancies are seldom harmless when adopted by more than one hand. Did you pen aught last night besides your own correspondence?" The young woman flushed. "I lent my desk to Sir Alistair. He had an enclosure to sign." "Indeed. And Mr. Pargeter, your duet partner, was he present?" She hesitated. "He called late in the evening, yes. He left before midnight." Holmes's eyes sharpened. "And did he touch your writing materials?" "I cannot say, but surely you do not suspect—" I suspect only what the evidence sings, madam. He bent, suddenly, lifting a handkerchief that had fallen to the carpet. It was of fine weave, edged with red silk, and faintly scented with anise. He handed it to her. "Yours?" She shook her head. "No, indeed, I have never seen it." Holmes pocketed the handkerchief with satisfaction. "Then our tenor is less careful with his notes than with his song. Come, Watson, we have heard enough for one movement. Let us see what harmony awaits at Mr. Pargeter's lodgings. There I think we may discover why a lawyer's voice should be silenced by a choir." And so, as the afternoon shadows lengthened across the wet stones of Bishopsgate, we set forth once more, the silent barrister beside us, his eyes pleading, and Holmes intent as ever upon the invisible melody of crime that only he seemed to hear. The road that led us toward Clerkenwell was narrow and ill-paved, and our cab swayed dangerously in the ruts as Holmes sat forward, the keen light of pursuit alive in his eyes. Sir Alistair leaned back against the worn leather, his hand pressed to his throat, as though he could will the voice back into being. I found my sympathy deepened with every moment, for never had I seen a man more cruelly robbed of his natural faculty. Holmes, however, seemed absorbed in the thread of evidence he had gathered, weaving it silently into one of those intricate patterns that always eluded me until the last revelation. At length he stirred from his abstraction and addressed me in that quiet tone which always heralded his clearer conclusions. "You observe the handkerchief, Watson, red silk, touched with anise. That scent is the echo of the pastilles. Whoever carried them also carried the drug. Now consider the silk thread from the dressing-room and the handkerchief in the library, both red, both foreign to Sir Alistair's household. That is no coincidence. It is the signature of a careless performer." "And you believe this performer is Mr. Pargeter?" I asked. Holmes' lips curved into the faintest smile. "We must not leap to conclusions. Yet he has placed himself in the very heart of our little choir. He visits late at night, lingers near the ink upon which our anonymous note depended, and leaves behind a trace of silk which marries the crime to his person. At the very least he must sing us a verse of explanation. When at last we arrived at the address Holmes had obtained, the street was one of those mean terraces that lie like scars across London, their windows dim and their curtains perpetually damp. The lodgings of Mr. Pargeter proved to be upon the second floor, reached by a stair so narrow I was obliged to follow Holmes single file. The landlady, a gaunt woman with an apron that bore witness to many skirmishes with grease, informed us that the gentleman was within. She eyed us suspiciously until Holmes whispered something that produced a sudden deference, and she ushered us to the door with a bob of the head. Inside we found a room modestly furnished, but touched here and there with the pretensions of a rising tenor. A score of sheet music lay upon the table, a cracked mirror stood against the wall, and beside it a velvet case contained a collar of a richness out of keeping with its surroundings. Mr. Pargeter himself rose quickly as we entered, a tall fellow with dark hair and a voice that greeted us in tones almost too honeyed. He feigned surprise at our visit, though the nervous movement of his hands suggested anything but ease. "Mr. Holmes? Dr. Watson? To what do I owe the honour?" Holmes inclined his head, his eyes darting about the chamber with quick, bird-like motions. "We are come on behalf of Sir Alistair Venn, whom you know well. His misfortune is grievous, and the time demands candour. You visited his house late last night?" Pargeter's smile stiffened. "Indeed I did. Miss Markham required rehearsal, and Sir Alistair himself welcomed me." Holmes raised a handkerchief between his fingers. "And you carried this away with you when you departed?" Pargeter blinked. "That is not mine." "Strange, It bears the same silk as the thread found in Sir Alistair's dressing room, where an intruder entered by night. How do you explain that harmony?" The tenor's eyes flickered with sudden alarm, though he sought to mask it with indignation. "I will not be accused upon such trifles. 100 handkerchiefs of red silk may exist in London. Surely you do not suggest—" "I suggest only that we test the notes," Holmes interrupted coolly. He crossed the room to the table, lifting one of the music sheets. His face hardened. "You copy your scores, Mr. Pargeter, with violet ink. I have seen the very hand upon the anonymous note which reached Sir Alistair this morning. Your lines are careful, yet you press too heavily upon the downstrokes. Here, upon this score, I see the same habit. Do you deny it?" For a moment the man's composure faltered. Then he drew himself up, his voice rising in indignant song. "I deny nothing and confess nothing. You may draw what fancy you please from ink and cloth, but I am no poisoner. My profession depends upon my voice, as Sir Alistair's does upon his. Would I destroy in another what I most value in myself?" Holmes regarded him with the calm of a judge weighing testimony. "Perhaps not with your own hand, yet the choir has many members, and a conductor is not always the man who sings the loudest. You will forgive us if we inquire further." He turned to the landlady. "Has your lodger received visitors these past nights?" She wrung her apron. "A gentleman, sir, once or twice, foreign-looking with a scarf pulled high. I thought little of it, save that they spoke in whispers." Holmes's eyes gleamed. "And did this visitor leave anything behind?" She pointed to a small cupboard. Holmes opened it without ceremony, and from the shadows he drew a small pasteboard box, impressed with a bishop's mitre. It was empty, but the inner surface bore the same anise scent that clung to the pastilles. "Enough," Holmes said softly. "The chorus grows louder." He turned upon Pargeter, who had paled visibly. "You will not leave London until this matter is resolved. I advise you to remain within easy reach, for silence may be more dangerous to you than song." With that we departed, leaving the unhappy tenor protesting his innocence to the air. As we descended the narrow stair, I could not refrain from whispering to Holmes. "You have him, surely. The box, the ink, the thread, they all point to Pargeter." Holmes shook his head. "Point, yes. Convict, no. He is a singer caught upon the wrong note, but the melody is deeper. There is a conductor behind this choir, Watson, and it is that hand we must unmask. Come, we shall return to Baker Street. I have yet to test the residue upon those lozenges, and the results may tell us whether we face a trick of chemistry or something more sinister still." We hailed another cab, Sir Alistair following silently, his eyes still burning with that desperate plea. Holmes leaned back, his face hidden in the rising smoke of his pipe, and I knew from experience that the case had entered its most perilous passage. The notes had been heard, the false chords struck. Now remained the task of unravelling the hidden harmony that threatened to silence a man's life's work. We were no sooner returned to Baker Street than Holmes had the chemical table cleared and the spirit lamp alight. He set the amber lozenges upon a watch-glass, crushed a fragment to powder, and worked with swift, precise movements. Sir Alistair watched, rigid in the armchair, while I noted pulse and temperature as if recording alone could defend a man's stolen faculty. "Observe, Watson," said Holmes, adding ether and shaking the mixture in a narrow tube. "The cloudiness which answers to Dragendorf's reagent, an alkaloid beyond question." The orange precipitate settled in flakes. He decanted, evaporated, then treated the residue with fuming nitric acid, let it dry, and washed it with strong spirit of potash. A faint violet bloomed like dusk upon heather. "Vitaly Morin," he murmured, "your thought was just. A trypane alkaloid, hyoscine, or its sister. The dryness, the tremor, the suppression of phonation. This is a singer's gag devised by a chemist. Reversible? I asked, glancing at Sir Alistair, whose eyes had fixed upon Holmes's lips as if they alone could issue a reprieve. With time and rest, yes, unless repeated to exhaustion, Holmes answered. Our choir promised permanence. It lies not in the drug, but in persuading the victim to dose himself again under fear. Wickedness with a bookkeeper's logic. He rinsed the glassware, corked the tube, and turned to the buff ticket upon the mantel. We must seek the font from which the pastilles were supplied. The bishop's mitre is a brand near St. Botolph's. His eyes narrowed. But the black sealing wax was stamped afterward. The packet has walked through unholy hands. Before the lamp had cooled, we were again in the street. The shop lay in a byway off Bishopsgate, a place of jars and cards. A mild, spectacled proprietor emerged at our bell, fingers dusted with sugar. St. Botolph's pastille, Holmes observed, tapping boxes bearing the mitre. Have you sold many such this week to gentlemen with a foreign air? Reassured, the man consulted a slate. A pair of dozens on Monday to a Mr. Pargate, a singer from the Institute, and last night, near closing, another parcel bought by a gentleman who spoke little and paid an exact pence. Describe him, said Holmes, tall, muffled in a scarf, with a scar along the jaw, as if from a surgeon's knife. He smelt of tar and oil, dockside. He tapped a whistle against his teeth while I wrapped his parcel. Holmes' eyes kindled. A boatswain's call, softened. Our butler's thin whistle is thus explained. You gave him no address? None, sir, but he asked the hour of the Institute rehearsal. We left with a sealed sample of the pastilles. In the cab, Holmes sat a minute, lids drooped, fingers beating cadences upon his knee. The pieces arranged themselves, Watson. Pargeter bought the boxes, a seafaring. Confederate altered and delivered them. A violet hand copied the letter. But the conductor, who has motive to break Venn's inquiry without blood? The warehouse syndicate stands to lose fortunes if the clerk's deposition is heard. To stifle the voice is cheaper than to bribe a jury. And Miss Markham? I ventured. I suspect her position, he replied. A ward within reach of admirers, a duet with the tenor, who served as convenience, a desk whose ink is pressed by frightened hands. She may be an instrument played upon by others. Sir Alistair tapped his slate and scrawled, When shall I speak? Holmes read and answered aloud for the comfort of the sound. Soon, if you obey me. Take no draught, no lozenge. Rest the throat and drink warm milk with soda. I shall send a draught to moisten the cords. Above all, you will not attend the Institute tomorrow until I send for you. It was evening when we regained Baker Street. Holmes ignored Mrs. Hudson's tea, rifling our index until he found a folder headed Dockside Whistlers. From it he drew a clipping concerning Ezra Pike, once a signalman aboard a Black Sea steamer, discharged after an injury that left a pale seam along his jaw and a gift for the whistle. Lodged of late in Houndsditch, Holmes read, and known to warehousemen as a handy night bird. Houndsditch lies but a turn from Bishopsgate, I said. Precisely. One more note must be struck. He caught up his Inverness. We shall call upon Mr. Pargeter once more, but not as ourselves. There is a piano tuner with a limp who plies these streets at dusk. I have long admired his discretion. If our singer keeps a foreign appointment, we shall be in the next room to applaud. Sir Alistair pressed Holmes's hand in gratitude. We left him to my instructions and set out into the thinning fog, Holmes altering his carriage, his shoulders rounding, his step acquiring that drag I had seen him practice before a mirror. The lamps came up along the terraces, and somewhere ahead a reedy whistle piped two short, one long. Holmes' eyes flashed sideways. No wind composes in Morse, he said softly. Come, Watson. The choir begins its rehearsal. Let us be sure we have the best seats in the house. The cry of the whistle came again, thin and quavering, as we crept along the dripping terrace of Houndsditch. Holmes had perfected the limp of his assumed piano tuner, his tool-bag slung across his shoulder, while I trailed as his assistant, burdened with a small case of tuning forks. The disguise was sufficient to draw no more than a passing glance from the loafers who clustered beneath the gas lamps, and in a few minutes we found ourselves before a lodging-house whose windows glowed faintly through stained curtains. Holmes nodded toward the upper floor, where a shadow crossed briefly against the lamplight. "Pargeter keeps his trysts," he murmured. "And if I mistake not, Ezra Pike whistles the overture." We entered by way of the side door, feigning the assurance of tradesmen on an errand. The landlady, a stout woman with a candle in hand, confronted us, but Holmes produced a slip of paper, scrawled with fictitious notes, claiming we had come at Mr. Pargeter's request to tend a piano. The name sufficed. She led us up the stairs with no more than a grunt, muttering about singers who practised at all hours. At the landing, Holmes signed to me for silence. Through the thin boards of the adjacent room, we could hear voices, one rich and resonant, Pargeter's unmistakable tenor, and another low, harsh, with the guttural tones of the sea. The cadence of a whistle followed, sharp and insistent, like the piping of a boatswain calling his men to task. Holmes motioned, and we pressed closer to the partition, listening intently. "No more delays," came Pike's rasp. "The pastilles worked. He was speechless this morning." "But not ruined," Pargeter objected. "Holmes was there, and the doctor. If they discover—" "Let them discover," Pike snapped. "He has swallowed one, another, and the cords stiffen. The inquiry collapses. Our masters pay well to silence tongues." "And what of me?" Pargeter said, his voice unsteady. "I lent my hand, but I will not swing for it. I never thought it should go so far." "You thought to profit, and profit you shall. Keep the girl under your charm. Her guardian trusts her, and through her we know his movements. One more lozenge, and the barrister's voice is dust. After that, you may sing as you please." The scrape of a chair and the thump of a fist on the table punctuated the words. Holmes' eyes glittered as he met mine, the corners of his mouth tightening. Quiet as a cat, he stooped, setting a finger against the crack of the door, peering through with infinite caution. I glimpsed the interior for a moment, a heavy-jawed sailor with a pale scar glistening under the lamplight, seated opposite the trembling figure of Pargeter. On the table between them lay a fresh packet, sealed with black wax. Holmes withdrew silently, motioning me back down the stair. Only when we were safe in the narrow passage did he permit himself a word. "The choir sings in tune, Watson. Pike is the player, Pargeter the obligato, and behind them stand patrons with purses deep enough to buy silence. We must cut short the performance before the finale is reached." We slipped into the street once more. Holmes hailed a constable, whispered rapidly, and within minutes arrangements were made for discreet surveillance of the lodging-house. "They will not leave tonight without our knowledge," he assured me. "But tomorrow, Watson, tomorrow is the day they will attempt the encore. We must be at the Institute." The following morning dawned bleak and grey. Holmes had slept not at all, pacing the carpet in long, restless strides, composing the scheme that now unfolded in his mind. At noon he dispatched a note to Sir Alistair instructing him to remain in seclusion and to trust absolutely to his guidance. By mid-afternoon we made our way to the Bishopsgate Institute, its new brick facade looming solemnly above the street, the tall windows glowing with preparations for the evening's rehearsal. Musicians bustled to and fro. Among them I recognized Miss Eleanor Markham, her anxious eyes scanning the crowd as if in search of reassurance. Holmes drew me aside. "We must watch the approach. If Pike means to deliver the final pastille, it will be today." We stationed ourselves near a side entrance. Presently, Pargeter appeared, pale and hurried, carrying a leather satchel. He exchanged a few quiet words with Miss Markham, who looked startled but followed him inside. Moments later, a tall figure with a muffler tight about his jaw and the unmistakable gait of a sailor slouched toward the door. From his pocket protruded the corner of a pasteboard box. Holmes touched my arm. "Now, Watson, the play is upon us." We intercepted Pike at the threshold. Holmes, with the sudden ferocity of a striking hawk, seized his wrist and plucked the box from his pocket. The sailor swore, struggling to free himself, but two constables who had shadowed us stepped forward to clap irons upon him. Inside the satchel taken from Pargeter we found more of the tampered lozenges, together with letters bearing the seal of a warehouse syndicate notorious for corruption. The evidence was damning. Pargeter, confronted by Holmes in the hall of the Institute, collapsed into a chair, confessing in a broken voice that he had been seduced by promises of wealth and career, drawn into the scheme to supply Pike with access to the household. Yet he protested, even through his tears, that he had never wished permanent harm to Sir Alister. Holmes listened without sympathy. "You lent your hand to silence an honest man and betrayed the trust of a lady who regarded you as her companion. Whether you sang the loudest or not, you were part of the choir. Let the law decide the pitch of your punishment." Miss Markham, white with shock, turned imploringly to us. Holmes, with a gentleness that belied his words to the guilty, assured her she was no party to the crime and that her wardship remained unsullied. Sir Alister himself, summoned to the Institute when the culprits were secured, clasped Holmes's hand in voiceless gratitude, his eyes shining with a relief words could not convey. That night, as we returned to Baker Street under the weary light of the lamps, I could not restrain my admiration. You unmasked them with nothing more than a thread, a scent, and a whistle. Holmes allowed himself the ghost of a smile. The smallest notes compose the grandest chords, Watson. A choir may roar with voices, yet it is the faintest whisper that betrays the harmony. The law will silence these singers, Sir Alister's own voice will return in due course. And thus another overture concludes. We had, scarcely, hung our coats when there came a sharp rap upon our door, and Inspector Lestrade entered, damp and irritable, with the look of a man who has been praised in the newspapers and therefore mistrusts his luck. He accepted Mrs. Hudson's tea, delivered his report with professional dryness, and left us the impression of success balanced on a knife edge. Pike was in custody, Pargeter under charge, the satchel and letters safe at the yard. Yet a nimble solicitor had appeared for the sailor within the hour, and a purse of sovereigns, no origin declared, had already paid his fees and proffered bail. If money could sing, Mr. Holmes, Lestrade concluded sourly, the choir would be a chorus of angels. Holmes, whose humour rises with danger, only nodded and asked, for the exact hour of the solicitor's visit, the name of the turnkey who held Pike's cell, and whether the prisoner had whistled since he was locked away. When Lestrade admitted that the fellow piped between his teeth like a kettle cooling, Holmes dismissed him with a quiet caution to set two men he trusted upon the sailor, and above all, to keep the arrests out of the evening papers. "Silence is the one luxury our adversary cannot purchase twice," he said, and the instant the door closed he began to range our sitting-room with those swift glances that gather purpose as a storm gathers wind. Night had not long folded over Baker Street when a telegraph boy battered our knocker. The envelope, redirected by Holmes from Sir Alister's address, bore the now familiar black wax and the faint ghost of anise. Upon the slip within, gummed letters arranged themselves into a cool threat. "The choir does not disband. The clerk will sing his last if the inquiry meets tomorrow. The girl is our guarantee. Holmes read it twice, breathed upon a corner, and showed me the dull crescent left by a greasy thumb. "A ledger hand," he murmured, "the sort that lives among figures and wipes its fingers on accounts. They grow bolder because they are pressed. Good. Pressure forces disclosure." At my exclamation for Miss Markham, he raised a finger. "A pawn is threatened to remove a queen. They will not hazard the ward if the guardian can be induced to despair. We answer by moving the board." He scribbled 3 telegrams, one to Lestrade, bidding him stifle rumour of the captures, one to the Institute announcing Sir Alister's sudden indisposition, and one, in a private cipher, to a bank acquaintance, inquiring which houses had lately ordered black sealing wax by the crate. "Where threats become routine," he said, "supplies must be regular. We shall follow commerce to conscience." Before dawn he had us rattling east in a cab towards Spitalfields. The clerk who held the affidavits was lodged, Sir Alister had written, in a poor house off a narrow court. We found the landlady with red hands and honest eyes. Yes, the gentleman kept quiet hours and paid in silver. No, she had not seen him since. The previous evening, when he complained of a dry throat and said he would sup early, Holmes went up like a cat. The door stood upon the latch, the bed was smooth, the grate unstained with ash, and upon a plate lay a joint scarcely touched. With his knife he teased from it a glittering crystal no larger than a pinhead, smelt of anise, and nodded. The pastilles ground and pricked into the supper. They quieted him, then fetched him. Look, the soot crescent again on the sill, and here a smear of wax. The same hand that posts our warnings removes our witness. He leaned into the cold air and studied the alley. 2 men stood below, the taller, with nails that pare putty, the shorter, set square to the wall. They took him riverward. Do not despair, Watson. Paper leaves a trail where boots do not. If Holmes's words were meant as comfort, his actions gave them backbone. By noon we had word from the yard that Pike had suffered a seizure and been dosed with laudanum by a tender-hearted turnkey. The file, traced back to a Houndsditch shop kept by the man's wife, had been purchased with 2 notes, stained, so the inspector swore, with a faint blush of violet. Holmes heard this without surprise. They prune their own branches. The sailor served, the sailor sleeps. The conductor will now play alone. He knotted a porter's muffler at his throat and thrust a folded paper into my hand. "I have prepared a message to Miss Markham inviting her to a private rehearsal at 7 this evening in a small room behind the Institute's organ loft. It will arrive from the same hand that menaced her guardian. You will see that she does not answer it, yet allow the appointment to be kept." I demanded by whom it should be kept, and he laughed softly. "By one whose voice they believe silenced. Tell Sir Alister to bring his slate and his courage. I will be elsewhere, in a counting-house where ledgers smell of wax and fear." Thus it was arranged. The Institute would be a hive under watch, the organ loft a snare baited with a mute barrister, and somewhere, behind a blind of figures and varnished respectability, the true chorister would step out to conduct his last piece. Holmes, before departing, stood a moment with his hands upon the mantel, and his eyes half closed, like a man listening to music no other ears could hear. "You may rely upon it, Watson," he said at last, "that the gentleman who holds the purse strings prefers whispers to songs and rooms with carpet to alleys with soot. I go to make him sing." Then, with that curious lightness of tread which attends his most decisive moods, he vanished into the London dusk, leaving me to shepherd our fragile caste to their marks and to pray that, when the curtain rose, the right voice would be heard. The evening drew on with a damp mist that clung to the lamps like gauze. I had brought Sir Alistair to the Institute by a circuitous route, careful that no follower should trace us. The Tsong barrister, still voiceless, leaned heavily upon my arm, his slate clasped like a shield. His expression betrayed both fear and a fierce determination not to yield, though I knew the effort of silence tormented him more cruelly than any blow. At the side entrance, a constable in plain clothes admitted us, and together we ascended the narrow stair that led to the organ loft. The chamber behind it was dark, save for a single lamp upon the table. The air smelled faintly of dust and varnished pipes. Sir Alistair took his seat where Holmes had indicated, his figure half in shadow, so that a watcher might take him for a man awaiting secret conference. I stationed myself where I could survey both the corridor and the small grated window overlooking the hall. Below, the musicians tuned their instruments, and the subdued murmur of a gathering audience drifted upward. The Institute's inquiry had been postponed officially, but rumours still ran through the city. Curious ears had come to see whether Sir Alistair would speak, or whether silence would indeed reign. The very uncertainty lent an air of tension that seemed to throb in the floorboards beneath our feet. Time passed in that strained stillness until footsteps crept along the corridor. The lamp trembled as a draught preceded the sound, and then a shadow paused at the door. The latch turned cautiously. A tall man in a cloak slipped inside, his muffler wound high to the eyes. He closed the door without sound, his gaze fixed upon Sir Alistair. From his pocket he drew a small vial, its glass catching the lamplight with a sinister gleam. He advanced a step, his free hand raised in what might have been reassurance or command. Before he could speak, I stepped forward, revolver drawn. "That will do, sir. You are expected." The man started, then recovered with an admirable coolness. His voice, low and deliberate, carried the accent of the counting-house rather than the dock. "You are mistaken, Doctor. I was summoned here by Sir Alistair himself." At this, our client scrawled rapidly upon his slate and held it up. "I wrote no message." The intruder's eyes flickered, and in that instant the door behind him opened again. Holmes entered with the noiseless certainty of a predator returning to its lair. He had cast aside the porter's muffler, and his keen gaze fastened upon the figure before us with unmistakable recognition. "Good evening, Mr. Chessel," Holmes said softly. "Treasurer of the London Warehouse Syndicate, if memory serves. You balance accounts better than you silence witnesses." The man's composure broke. He clutched the vial as though to dash it against the floor. Holmes was upon him in a bound, wrenching it from his grip and pinning his arm with a strength that belied his slender frame. I hurried to assist, and between us we secured him to the heavy chair. Holmes examined the vial. Chloroform mixed with the same tropane tincture. You would have pressed it to his lips, left him insensible, and by morning his cords would have refused their duty altogether. A tidy calculation, but too late. Chessel glared, yet the set of his jaw betrayed defeat. "You cannot prove I meant harm. I came at his request." Holmes smiled thinly. "Your wax will prove it. The same supply that seals your ledgers sealed Pike's packets. The thumbprint of your own clerk lies upon the threats. And the sailor, before they poisoned him with laudanum, muttered of payments delivered by a man with a pen behind his ear and a scarlet ring upon his hand. You wear it still." He tapped the gold band on Chessel's finger, set with a dull ruby. "Your choir is disbanded, sir. The chorus has sung its last." Sir Alistair rose, his face flushed with the fury of one who sees at last the architect of his ruin. He pointed to his throat, then to the captive, and his eyes blazed with eloquence beyond words. Holmes placed a hand upon his arm. "Patience! Your voice will return, and with it the law. This man will answer where your own tongue was forbidden." The door admitted Lestrade and two constables at that moment, summoned by Holmes at the instant he departed us earlier. The inspector surveyed the scene with a grunt of satisfaction. So, the treasurer himself! I thought as much when I heard how quick the solicitor appeared for Pike. Well, Mr. Holmes, you've plucked the conductor's baton from his hand. Chessel was taken away, still protesting faintly, though the clink of irons muffled his authority. When the chamber was quiet again, Holmes seated himself, fingers pressed together, his eyes abstracted. "Observe, Watson, how every small detail sang its note, the red silk of a singer's handkerchief, the soot upon a sill, the flavour of anise, the whispers of a whistle. Each alone was trivial, together they composed the anthem of conspiracy. Had we failed to attend to the least, the melody might never have been complete." I could not restrain my admiration. "And Sir Alister's voice, do you truly believe it will return?" With care and abstention from further insult, yes. The drug's grip is temporary, designed to frighten rather than destroy. A few days, and the chords will recover. He shall speak at his inquiry, and his enemies shall hear every syllable. Holmes looked to the barrister, whose gratitude shone plainly in his eyes. "Your silence, Sir Alister, has spoken louder than their threats. Soon your words will complete the task." The strains of rehearsal drifted faintly through the floorboards below, but to me it seemed as though the real performance had already been played out in that dim chamber, with Holmes as conductor and Justice as the final chorus. Yet I knew from experience that his mind would not rest upon applause. Even as we descended the stair and stepped once more into the damp night, his lips were pursed in thought, and I heard him murmur, "The choir is finished, Watson, but London is an endless theatre. Somewhere another overture begins." The night after Chessel's arrest was restless in Baker Street. Sir Alister, still robbed of speech, but calmer now that his enemy had been revealed, had retired under my supervision to lodgings nearby. Holmes sat opposite me in the lamplight, his violin idle upon his knee, his gaze fixed on the dark beyond the window. The fire hissed, as if reluctant to disturb his concentration. At length he spoke in that quiet, deliberate tone that always made me aware that the case was not yet concluded. "You believe we have reached the coda, Watson. Yet a conductor, once removed, does not silence the whole orchestra. Chessel was treasurer. He balanced sums and signed cheques. But who gave him the score?" I frowned. "The warehouse syndicate itself. Their fortunes stood at hazard, and he was their instrument." Holmes shook his head. "A body of merchants does not concoct poisons or enlist sailors from Houndsditch. That work is the province of one mind, cunning enough to use Chessel as treasurer, Pike as errand boy, and Pargeter as lure. The choir had a choirmaster, and he has not yet shown his face." Before I could reply, a knock sounded. Lestrade entered with a newspaper damp from the press. He slapped it upon the table, pointing to the headline, "Warehouse Treasurer in Police Net." We did our best to keep it quiet, but the devil's out. The syndicate denies knowledge, claims Chessel acted alone, and now cries persecution. To make matters worse, the clerk who held the affidavits is missing still, and unless he appears at once, the inquiry collapses. They will argue Chessel never touched the case. Holmes scanned the column. "The press hastens the villain's hand. He will strike tonight or not at all. The missing clerk is the last witness, and without him Venn's testimony cannot stand alone. We must find the fellow before dawn." "Find him where?" I demanded. Holmes rose, his eyes bright with that inner fire. "In the river, if we delay. In a counting-house, if we move quickly." He snatched his coat. "Come, Watson. Lestrade, summon 2 men you can trust and follow. We go to Limehouse." The fog lay heavy upon the docks, curling round the rigging like shrouds. Gas lamps flared dimly, half lost in the mist, while the Thames lapped black against the pilings. Holmes led us unerringly through alleys that smelt of tar and decay, pausing at length before a warehouse whose windows glowed faintly behind boarded shutters. "Here, Watson," he whispered. "Note the sign, Harper and Loom, exporters of grain. A respectable house, yet this is the third consignment of black sealing wax ordered from their address. Commerce masks conspiracy." We crept round the side. A barred door stood ajar, and from within came the muffled scrape of boxes dragged across boards. Holmes slipped inside, and I followed, revolver ready. The gloom resolved into stacks of crates. Between them, a lantern threw uncertain light on two figures. One was Pike's sailor comrade, the other a thin clerk in shabby coat, bound to a chair. His head lolled as though drugged. Holmes sprang forward, seizing the sailor before he could draw his knife. The man roared, but Lestrade and his constables rushed in behind us, clapping irons upon him. I bent to the clerk, loosening the cords and pressing my ear to his lips. His breath was shallow, but he lived. A bitter scent rose from his clothes, the same anise that haunted every step of the case. Holmes examined a bottle upon the table. "The same tincture, Watson. They meant to quiet him until the inquiry was past. A quieter death than the river, but just as final." He straightened, his expression grim. "Yet, still I do not see the master hand. This sailor is but another echo." Even as he spoke, a fresh sound reached us, the patter of retreating steps upon the stair. Holmes darted after it, swift as a hound on scent, and I close at his heels. We emerged into the fog just as a figure vaulted a crate and vanished into the maze of alleys. Holmes gave chase, the mist swallowing us all. I heard only the beat of our pursuit and the ragged breathing of the fugitive. Twice I glimpsed a silhouette, tall and spare, his cloak flaring behind him. He ran not like a dock thief, but with the measured stride of a man used to open roads. At last we burst into a small yard hemmed with walls. The figure had vanished. Holmes stooped, examining the ground by the dim light of a lamp. "See here, Watson, impressions sharp as steel, the heel and toe of a riding boot, not a sailor's shoe. Our choirmaster rides, and tonight he fled, with his face still hidden. But he exists. Chessel was the purse, Pike the whistle, Pargeter the lure, yet this was the brain. And until we unmask him, Sir Alistair's voice will not be safe." We carried the rescued clerk to safety, dosing him with draughts to ease his stupor. As the first pallor of dawn touched the river, we saw him breathe more freely, his eyes fluttering open with a ghost of recognition. Holmes, watching intently, murmured, "The inquiry may yet be heard. But before it rings out, Watson, I must know who writes the music." He straightened, and I saw that fierce light still burning in his gaze. "The choir has lost its conductor's score, yet the hand that composed it remains, and I shall not rest until I hear his name." The pale morning found us back in Baker Street, the rescued clerk asleep in my care, and Holmes pacing like a caged hawk. The fog of the river still clung to his coat, and the lamplight sharpened the angular lines of his face. He had spoken little since our pursuit ended in the yard, but now, with his hands clasped behind him and his gaze fixed on the carpet, he began to unravel the silence. "We have heard the notes, Watson, but the melody is unfinished. The fugitive last night was no dockhand. His stride bespoke breeding, and his boots were cut by a Bond Street maker." "A gentleman composes this score," I started. "You mean one of the syndicate's patrons, a nobleman?" "Precisely. Commerce required the treasurer, intimidation required the sailor, but orchestration requires influence. Consider the threats. The language was crisp, the paper fine, the construction cautious yet arrogant. This is no handwriting of a clerk forced to villainy. It is a gentleman's amusement seasoned with cruelty. At that moment Sir Alistair entered, his face pale but determined. He had forced a few whispers from his throat during the night, hoarse and broken, but enough to signal hope of recovery. He wrote swiftly upon his slate, "Clerk safe, inquiry to proceed." Holmes inclined his head. "The clerk lives. By the morrow he may testify. Yet I urge caution. Until the choirmaster is unmasked, your voice and his life remain at hazard. They will not surrender, while their conductor remains free." Lestrade arrived soon after with news that Pike had been found dead in his cell, laudanum bottle shattered upon the floor. The turnkey swore the prisoner had hidden it upon his person, though Holmes dismissed this with a sharp gesture. It was given to him, a final verse sung to ensure no discordant testimony. Thus one accomplice is silenced, another waits in jail, and the treasurer is in irons. Yet the hand that directed them all moves unchallenged. Sir Alistair scrawled furiously, "I suspect one man, Lord Canterlow. He chairs the warehouse trust." Holmes's eyes gleamed. Indeed, his name has danced at the edge of every report. A peer of the realm, accustomed to silence inconvenient voices with coin. He alone has the standing to bribe sailors, to procure drugs, to set clerks trembling. The figure in the yard bore his height, his carriage. The ruby ring on Chesil's finger was his gift, I have no doubt. But suspicion is not proof. We must draw him into declaring himself. The day wore on in tense preparation. Holmes disappeared for several hours, leaving me with Sir Alistair and the clerk, whose strength returned with broth and rest. When my friend returned at dusk, his eyes shone with that suppressed excitement I had learned to read as victory approaching. He laid upon the table a folded paper, stamped with the crest of the House of Lords. "A letter of summons," he explained. "Lord Canterlow is called tomorrow morning to a private conference concerning the inquiry. He believes it an affair of state. In reality, he will find himself seated opposite the very man whose voice he sought to extinguish." I stared at him in astonishment. "You forged this?" Holmes smiled thinly. "An exact imitation of official form. The ink and wax were borrowed from a friendly clerk at Whitehall. He will not question it until it is too late. There we shall confront him with Chesil's confession, the sailor's testimony taken before his death, and the recovered clerk himself. A trap baited with honour and sealed with law." Sir Alistair gripped Holmes' hand, gratitude shining in his tired eyes. He attempted to whisper, but only a rasp emerged. Holmes stopped him gently. "Save your voice, sir. Tomorrow it must ring clear. One syllable spoken in truth will undo their whole conspiracy." That night I scarcely slept, haunted by the image of a peer of England stooping to such villainy. At dawn we accompanied Sir Alistair to a discreet chamber near Westminster, the clerk at his side, Lestrade, and 2 constables posted at the door. Precisely at 10 the sound of wheels echoed in the courtyard, and a tall figure cloaked in black descended from a carriage. His bearing was imperious, his glance cold, and on his hand gleamed a ruby ring that caught the sun like blood. Lord Canterlow swept into the chamber, annoyance on his brow at being summoned so early. Holmes greeted him with impeccable courtesy. "My lord, forgive the urgency. The matter of the Bishopsgate inquiry required immediate consultation. You will oblige us by sitting." Canterlow's eyes travelled around the room, narrowing as they fell upon Sir Alistair and the clerk. A flicker, half surprise, half disdain, crossed his features, quickly mastered. He seated himself, folding his gloved hands upon the table. "I trust, Mr. Holmes, that you have not inconvenienced me without cause." Holmes leaned forward, his voice low and precise. "The cause, my lord, is that your choir has sung too loudly. The treasurer confesses. The sailor is dead by your gift. The tenor trembles in jail, and yet the conductor remains. We know the hand that ordered the wax, the lips that whispered to Pike, the boots that marked the yard. Shall we speak plainly, Lord Cantelow, or do you prefer the music of denial?" The nobleman's eyes blazed with sudden fury, though his voice was smooth. "This is insolence! You dare accuse a peer without proof?" Holmes opened his case and laid upon the table the vials seized from Chessel, the forged letters bearing violet ink, and the sailor's whistle. "Proof enough for any court, but the final note will be struck by Sir Alistair himself, whose voice you strove to silence." At this, the barrister rose. His throat rasped, but with supreme effort he forced the words, "I speak, my lord, and I accuse you." His voice cracked, hoarse, yet unmistakably audible. The sound reverberated through the chamber like a bell breaking silence. Lord Cantelow sprang to his feet, but Lestrade and his men closed upon him. The nobleman's face contorted with rage, yet the defiance in his eyes could not disguise his defeat. Holmes, unruffled, regarded him as one might a specimen secured at last in the net. "The choir is finished, my lord. Its conductor may now retire from the stage." The instant Lord Cantelow felt Lestrade's hand upon his sleeve, he ceased to struggle and drew himself up with the chilling composure of a man accustomed to impunity. His gaze moved from the inspector to Holmes, with an appraising coldness, as if he had discovered an insect with sting. "You presume much," he said evenly, "and yet I see nothing here that touches me." Holmes's eyes held that dry merriment which in him is kin to pity. "On the contrary, each trifle speaks. Heard together, they sound your name. The black sealing wax ordered by the crate through Harper and Loom, a house you steer by proxy, the pastilles bought by your treasurer and altered by your dockside hireling, the threats gummed from newspapers like those shredded in your basket, the laudanum paid with notes drawn from your private drawer, and, in Limehouse, the wedge-slit heel of Carstairs stamped upon wet clay." Cantelow's lip curled. "Conjecture." "Conjecture tested," Holmes returned. "Carstairs confirms a pair delivered to your house. Your treasurer confesses payments from a hand that wore a ruby seal, and you oblige us by wearing it. You erred with Miss Markham. Your forged summons used the same bruised stamp I noted on Chessel's letters. You share a seal and a carelessness. Pride economizes where prudence would purchase silence." The nobleman coloured, then turned to Sir Alistair, whose hoarse breath sounded loud in the hush. "If I acted," he said, "I acted to preserve credit from demagogues. Your inquiry threatened houses that feed half London. What is a temporary indisposition weighed against 1,000 labourers' bread?" A flicker of contempt crossed Holmes's face. "You drugged a man's instrument because you dared not face a deposition. That is not stewardship, it is cowardice in a white glove. Inspector, you have enough for conspiracy, assault, and unlawful detention." Lestrade, who had watched like a terrier, yearning for the word, snapped the bracelets and recited the charge. Cantelow submitted with icy silence, though a tremor ran through his gloved hand when Sir Alistair, mastering his chords, forced a single phrase, "You will answer," and let it hang like judgment. When the door closed upon the party, the room sank to stillness broken only by the clerk's breathing and the distant murmur of wheels. Holmes remained seated, head bowed, as if listening to the last overtone of a long chord. When he rose, the keen edge had passed from his manner. "The rest is machinery, Watson," he said. "We have played our part. The law will creak through its course." That afternoon we conveyed Sir Alistair home. His voice, strengthened by rest, and the draught I prescribed, answered now in short, serviceable fragments. Miss Markham met us with a bravery that did her credit. She pressed Holmes's hand without speech, and in her eyes I read a gratitude that would take a lifetime to exhaust. Holmes, who shuns emotion as he shuns a draught upon his violin, escaped with a bow and a counsel to avoid violet ink. We dined early at Baker Street. Holmes refused the claret and took to his pipe, the blue wreaths building a private fog wherein his thoughts moved like dim ships. I waited, knowing the impulse to lay bare his reasoning would seize him when the tobacco burned low. So it proved. He began without preface, his voice uncoloured, his sentences falling like counters upon a board. "The surest path," said he, "lay where blood was forbidden. A scandal touching the peerage must not be stained with death. Therefore the weapon would rob, not ruin, frighten, not finish. Trepaine supplied the effect. Aeneas cloaked it. A whistle summoned a servant who could take and be taken. The soot crescent on Ven's sill told me our men entered from height and habit. The red silk, the Aeneas on the handkerchief, the violet on the score, the mitred box, the black wax, each a small note, together an anthem. When Pike was dosed in his cell, I heard the conductor's fear. When the clerk was shifted to Limehouse, I heard his impatience. A gentleman's stride finished the phrase. "And the final snare?" I asked. "Pride," said he simply. "He trusted seals and summonses. I sent the one he could not doubt, and he walked into daylight." He grew silent, and the fire made small, dry sounds. Outside, St. Marylebone chimed the hour. Holmes set down his pipe and leaned back with that rare gentleness which, when it comes, transforms his features. "I confess a satisfaction beyond the common, Watson. To restore a man's voice is to restore his liberty. Our client will speak tomorrow, the clerk will corroborate, and London will hear how a choir was paid to sing silence." I looked at him, remembering the nights in fog and the thin cry of the whistle. "Is it ever over, Holmes?" He smiled, the old irony glinting for a moment. "For tonight, perhaps, until the next discord." Even as he spoke, wheels rattled to a halt below. A messenger mounted our stair at speed. Holmes rose, alert once more, ears pricked to faint news summons. The messenger's knock brought a hush to the room, and Holmes, ever impatient of ceremony, tore the envelope before Mrs. Hudson had withdrawn. His eyes scanned the slip, and a quiet satisfaction touched his features. "From Lestrade," he said. "Lord Canterlow has been remanded. The clerk gave his testimony in full. Sir Alistair spoke for himself with more vigour than I anticipated, and the magistrate has bound the case over for trial. The choir is not merely disbanded, Watson, it is silenced." Relief swept over me. I thought of the nights in fog, the sinister scent of anise, the desperate eyes of a man robbed of his voice, and I thanked Providence for the patience and brilliance of my companion. Sir Alistair himself arrived before the evening was out, his speech still hoarse but recognizable, each word a triumph. He clasped Holmes's hands in both of his, unable to find utterance for the gratitude that overflowed in his face. Miss Markham followed, her composure restored, though I saw her tremble when the memory of treachery shadowed her thoughts. Holmes, courteous but distant, received their thanks as though they had commended him for mending a clock. When they had departed, he sank into his chair with violin upon his knee. A few notes sounded low and deliberate, filling the room with something mournful yet resolute. I could not keep silent. "Surely you feel pride in this, Holmes? To have restored a man's freedom, to have unmasked corruption at the very summit of commerce." He lowered the bow, a smile faint at the corner of his lips. "Pride, Watson, is for men who require applause. For me, the harmony lies in the truth itself. A case is but a composition of facts. When the last bar is struck, the melody is complete. Whether the world hears it is of less account." I shook my head at his cold modesty, but he continued more gently. "Yet I confess there was pleasure in this score. To watch a peer brought low, not by sabre or scandal, but by the smallest notes, a thread of silk, a soot smudge, the whisper of a whistle. These are the instruments I play, Watson, and in them lies the only music I care for. The fire sank to embers, the city's hum softened, and Baker Street resumed its habitual calm. I took up my pen to record the affair, already shaping the tale that would one day remind me of the peril and the triumph. Holmes drew from his violin a final chord, rich and haunting, that lingered in the air like a benediction. And so ended the strange affair of the lost voice at Bishopsgate, in which corruption sought to still a man's tongue and was itself unmasked by a mind that hears where others are deaf. Holmes laid aside his bow, lit his pipe, and with that curious mixture of arrogance and detachment which was his alone, remarked, "The case, Watson, is concluded. Let us leave the choir to the law and listen for the next discord London has to offer.